Wow. You guys have sent in some really fascinating material for this deep dive.
Yeah.
It looks like we're going to be exploring the intersection of music
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
Orthodox mysticism.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
I mean, that's
Yeah, something I've thought a lot about before.
it's really fascinating. It's a fascinating area. And,
Yeah,
we're not just talking about music that's vaguely,
right,
inspired by spirituality.
right.
We're going to be looking at a composer whose work is deeply rooted in Orthodox mystical theology.
Okay.
And our main source is an excerpt from a doctoral thesis about his music written in Greek.
All right, color me intrigued.
Yeah.
Tell me more about this composer.
Okay.
Who is he and what makes his story so unique?
Well, this composer actually had a major creative crisis early in his career after a concert that was poorly received.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it really shook him up, made him question everything about his approach to music.
I can imagine. I can imagine how devastating that would be. It's one thing to kind of doubt your own work, but to have those doubts kind of confirmed in such a public way,
Yeah, it was
yeah, that must have been tough.
it was a turning point for him.
Yeah.
It pushed him to search for a deeper meaning in his music, something beyond just pleasing an audience or following trends.
Uh-huh.
And that search led him to Orthodox mystical theology.
Okay, so that's how we ended up exploring mysticism. But
Yeah.
how does that actually translate into music?
It's all about a concept called apophatic or negative theology, which the thesis digs deep into. It's a
Okay.
way of understanding God through what he is not rather than through direct description.
So instead of saying God is this or God is that,
Right.
you're saying God is not this, God is not that.
Right.
That's a pretty unusual way to approach things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's acknowledging that human language and intellect are limited when it comes to describing something as vast and ultimately unknowable as God.
It sounds almost like a musical approach in itself.
Right.
Defining something by the spaces around it, by what it isn't, rather than trying to pin it down with a precise definition.
You're picking up on something really important there.
Yeah.
This idea of defining through negation is central to the composer's work, and the thesis highlights how this connects to a core concept from St. Maximus the Confessor,
Okay.
eschatological becoming.
Okay. I have to admit, I'm not familiar with that term.
Okay.
Can you break that down
hmm
for me and for our listener and tell us why this concept is so important to understanding the composer's work?
In a nutshell, eschatological becoming is about this constant state of becoming striving towards an end that lies outside ourselves.
Okay.
It's about embracing the journey, the process of evolution, rather than focusing on a fixed destination. And this composer sees this reflected in his own musical approach, always evolving, always experimenting, never settling for a fixed style.
So it's like his music is on a journey, never arriving at a final destination.
Right.
I can see how that ties into the negative theology idea,
Yeah.
defining something by what it's not rather than some static fixed definition.
Yeah.
But how does that actually play out in his music?
Well, one way is through his use of microtonality and extended techniques, which create sounds that are constantly evolving and morphing.
Okay.
Think of it this way. Instead of hearing a clear, defined note, you might hear something that's bending and shifting, almost like it's searching for something.
So it's not about traditional melodies or harmonies.
Yeah.
We're talking about sound that push the boundaries of what we normally think of as music.
Absolutely. And this constant transformation of sound directly mirrors that concept of eschatological, becoming always changing, always in flux. But it's not just a chaotic wall of sound. There's a very deliberate structure to it.
That's interesting. When I think of experimental music that pushes boundaries,
Yeah.
I think of John Cage and his embrace of randomness and chance.
Right.
Is that the kind of thing we're talking about here?
Not quite. This composer actually uses silence as a key element in his music, but not in the same way as Cage. He's not interested in the ambient sounds that happen to occur during a performance. His use of silence is about creating a meditative space within the music, a point of focus for the listener.
Okay.
It's almost like a sonic palette cleanser.
I see what you mean. These shifting, morphing sounds, contrasted with moments of pure silence.
It's making me think about those visual illusions where the image seems to change depending on how you look at it.
Yeah,
Is there something of that in this composer's music?
that's a great.
Is he trying to challenge our expectations of what music should sound like?
That's a great analogy. And yes, he's definitely challenging those expectations. And he takes it a step further by giving performers a degree of freedom in how they interpret his scores.
So not just following the notes exactly as they're written.
Right.
That sounds pretty radical, especially if we're talking about music that's already pushing boundaries in terms of sound.
It is. He wants performers to bring their own unique experiences and understanding to the music, reflecting that personal subjective experience of becoming.
Each performance becomes a unique exploration of the material, never fixed or definitive. But it's not just about sonic exploration.
Right.
This composer draws inspiration from a wide range of sources, including visual art and film.
Okay, I have to ask, are we talking about the painters and filmmakers you mentioned earlier?
You're right on track.
The ones who use blocks of color and long takes?
Yeah.
Tell me more about how those influences play out in his music.
You're right on track. He's particularly drawn to Rothko's multiform paintings,
Ah, yeah.
those abstract canvases with blocks of color. And he's also fascinated by filmmaker Michael Haneke's use of long takes, those extended, unbroken shots that draw you into the moment.
I love Rothko's work.
Yeah.
Those blocks of color seem to vibrate, to shift and change depending on how you look at them.
Exactly.
And Haneke's films are so intense, so immersive.
Yeah.
How does the composer translate these visual and cinematic ideas into music?
He's adapted Stravinsky's block form technique, but with a twist.
Okay.
Instead of blocks of notes, he creates textural blocks. Sections of music defined by the unique sound and texture created through those extended techniques we talked about.
Okay.
And inspired by Haneke, he uses extended durations to hold a single musical idea for a long period of time, creating a sense of timelessness or heightened awareness in certain sections.
So instead of like a quick melody that comes and goes,
Right.
you might hear a single sound or texture that just hangs in the air, almost like time is standing still.
Yeah.
It sounds like he's trying to capture those same qualities of ambiguity, constant transformation and immersion that you find in Rothko's paintings and Haneke's films.
Exactly. And he blends these influences with yet another major movement in contemporary music, spectral music.
Okay.
But even here, his approach is unique. He's actually quite critical of the French spectral school.
Wait, he's critical of spectral music?
Yeah.
That's surprising. I always thought of spectral music as being pretty experimental and boundary pushing. Why wouldn't he be on board with that?
Well, he feels that the French spectral school, with its emphasis on the scientific analysis of sound, can sometimes make the music feel too calculated, too dead. It's like they're dissecting the sound and taking away some of its life force in the process.
I can see his point. It reminds me of how some people critique certain types of electronic music for being too cold or sterile. Like it's all about the technology and not enough about the human emotion behind it.
Exactly, and this is where his connection to the Romanian spectral school comes in, particularly a composer named Ioancu Dumitrescu.
Okay.
They're less interested in dissecting sound scientifically and more focused on the phenomenology of sound, how it's actually experienced by the listener in real time.
So it's more about the emotional and physical impact of the sound, how it makes you feel, rather than how it can be broken down and analyzed that makes sense given his interest in mysticism.
You've got it. And this composer's own approach to creating those complex, multi-layered sounds we talked about earlier seems to be inspired by both the French and Romanian schools. But with a fascinating twist, he actually draws inspiration from Byzantine music as well.
Byzantine music, that's fascinating. It's not something you hear mentioned every day in the context of contemporary music. What aspects of Byzantine music influence his work?
It's mostly about the modal system. Byzantine music uses a different modal system than Western music, and it seems to have influenced his unique way of constructing sonorities and harmonies, those clusters and textures that we talked about earlier.
So he's pulling from all these diverse sources,
Mhm.
spectral music, Byzantine music, even visual art and film. Is it fair to say he's creating something entirely new out of those ingredients, or is it more about reinterpreting those influences through a mystical lens?
It's a bit of both, really. He's definitely forging his own path, but he's also drawing on the rich history of musical expression. And the thesis actually compares his work to another important composer who's known for his radical approach to sound, Helmut Lachenmann.
Oh, interesting. What are the connections between them? Do they share a similar musical language or approach?
Well, Lachenmann is known for his musique concrète instrumentale. Essentially, it's about deconstructing traditional musical sounds and making us hear them in a new way. He wants us to experience their raw physicality, stripped of their traditional associations.
So taking the familiar sounds we expect from instruments and turning them on their head, I can see how that would fit with the whole apophatic idea of defining through negation that we talked about earlier.
Exactly, and the thesis points out how both Lachenmann and this composer emphasize the physicality of performance, but in different ways, our composer actually invented new notation symbols to capture the nuances of physical action involved in playing an instrument.
Wow, no notation symbols, that's dedication. So we're not just talking about the notes themselves, but about how the musician's body interacts with the instrument to create those sounds.
Precisely. It's about recognizing that music isn't just an abstract sequence of sounds, but a physical act, a collaboration between the mind, body, and instrument.
It sounds like he's really trying to push the boundaries of what we consider musical notation to capture not just the sound, but the energy and the action behind it. But tell me, with all this experimentation and boundary pushing, is there still a place for something as traditional as handwriting in his process?
Absolutely. In fact, this composer insists on using handwritten scores. He sees them as a more direct and personal connection to his music, especially in today's digital age.
That's interesting. So much of contemporary music relies heavily on technology, both in its creation and performance. Why do you think he's chosen to stick with pen and paper?
I think it's about finding that balance between tradition and innovation. It's a symbolic act that connects him to the history of musical creation. It's also important to remember that for this composer, intuition plays a huge role in his creative process.
So he doesn't have everything planned out in advance. He's leaving space for discovery as he goes along.
Hmm.
I imagine that takes a certain amount of trust in the process, especially when you're dealing with such complex musical ideas.
Absolutely. He views his compositions as reflections of his own subconscious, full of discoveries to be made both by him and by the listener. And I think that's a key to understanding the power of his music. It's an invitation to go on a journey to explore these complex sonic landscapes and find your own meaning within them.
It's like he's saying, here are the tools, the sounds, the ideas. Now go explore and discover your own truth within this world.
That's a great way to put it. And this brings us back to that central theme of mysticism that we talked about at the beginning, this idea that true understanding comes not from intellectual analysis, but from direct intuitive experience.
That makes a lot of sense. He's taking this ancient mystical concept and translating it into a completely modern and radical musical language.
Yeah.
But I have to ask, how is this music actually received by audiences? Is it something that people connect with on an emotional and spiritual level, or is it more of an intellectual exercise?
That's a great question, and it's one that the thesis doesn't really address directly, but I think
Yeah.
it depends on the listener.
Yeah.
Some people might find this music challenging, even alienating, but for others, it could be a profound and transformative experience.
I can see that. I imagine some listeners might feel lost without those familiar musical landmarks, melodies, harmonies, rhythms to hold on to.
Right.
But for those willing to let go and embrace the unknown, it sounds like this music could offer a powerful way to connect with something deeper within themselves.
Exactly. It's about surrendering to the experience, allowing yourself to be swept away by the sound, the textures, the silences. And I think that's where the connection to mysticism really comes alive. It's about transcending the purely intellectual and tapping into something more intuitive, more visceral.
It's making me think about those moments in life when you experience something truly awe-inspiring, a breathtaking sunset, a profound work of art, a deep connection with another person.
Right.
There's a sense of wonder, of mystery.
Yeah.
It can't be explained or analyzed. It just is.
Right.
And it sounds like this composer is trying to capture that same feeling through music.
That's a beautiful way to put it. He's creating a sonic space for contemplation, for connecting with something larger than ourselves. And just like those experiences you describe, the meaning is ultimately up to the individual to discover.
I'm really struck by this idea of the listener as an active participant in the creative process.
Uh-huh.
It's not just about passively consuming the music, but about engaging with it, exploring it, and finding your own personal meaning within it.
Exactly. The composer is offering us a set of tools, a framework for exploration, but he's not dictating the outcome. It's about embracing the journey, the process of becoming that we talked about earlier.
It's like he's inviting us to step outside of our comfort zones, to challenge our preconceived notions of what music can be, and to open ourselves up to new possibilities of experience. And who knows, maybe in doing so, we might just discover something new about ourselves in the process.
Absolutely. And that's what makes this whole exploration of music and mysticism so fascinating. It's about pushing boundaries, challenging conventions, and ultimately expanding our understanding of what it means to be human.
Well said. I think we've given our listener plenty to chew on today, and maybe, just maybe, this deep dive will inspire them to explore the world where music and mysticism intersect, and to discover their own unique path within it.